The carriage rocked hard as it turned onto the gravel path, and Alina Hartley gripped the seat with both hands, her heart pounding faster than the horse's hooves outside. Her father sat across from her, his face pale, his hands trembling around a letter he refused to let go of. She had never seen him so afraid. "Father, please," she said, "tell me what is happening. You have not spoken a full sentence since this morning." Lord Hartley looked up at his daughter, and for a moment the strong man she had always known seemed to vanish, replaced by someone small and broken. "We are ruined, Alina," he whispered. "The debts have caught up with us. Men will come for this house within the month, if I cannot find a way to pay what is owed." Alina felt the floor of the carriage tilt beneath her, though nothing had truly moved. Ruined. The word echoed in her mind like a struck bell. She thought of the servants who depended on her family, of her younger brother still away at school, of the portraits of her mother that hung in the hallway, portraits that would soon belong to strangers if nothing changed. "There must be something we can do," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "There is always something." Her father folded the letter slowly, as though touching it too roughly might make the disaster inside it more real. "There is one thing," he said. "But I fear you will not like it." Alina waited, her breath caught in her throat. "The Duke of Ashworth requires a wife," her father continued. "Not for love. His father's will demands he marry before the year is finished, or he loses control of the estate to a distant cousin who would ruin everything the family has built. Lady Camden, an old friend of your mother's, wrote to me. She believes you would suit him well. A marriage of convenience, Alina. It would save us. It would save everyone." The words settled over her like a heavy blanket, warm in the sense of safety it offered, but suffocating all the same. Marry a man she had never met. Give her life to a stranger, simply because both of their circumstances demanded it. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. Her father did not answer right away. He did not need to. The silence told her everything. That night Alina sat by her window for a long time, watching the stars blink over the fields she had grown up running through as a child. She thought of the dreams she once had, dreams of choosing her own path, of falling in love the way stories described it, slowly and sweetly, built on trust rather than necessity. Those dreams felt impossibly far away now. But she thought too of her father's trembling hands, of her brother's future, of the servants who had cared for her since she was small. A duke's wife would want for nothing. Her family would be safe. Perhaps love was a luxury she could not afford, not when so many people depended on her courage. By morning, she had made her decision. The letter of agreement arrived from Ashworth Hall within the week, written in a hand so precise it seemed almost cold. There was no warmth in it, no kindness, only terms. The marriage would take place within a fortnight. Alina would receive the title of Duchess, and her family's debts would be settled in full. In exchange, she would live at Ashworth Hall and fulfill the duties expected of a duke's wife. Nothing more was promised. Nothing more was asked. Alina read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it carefully inside her writing desk, as if hiding it away might soften the reality of what she had agreed to. 2 days before the wedding, Lady Camden came to visit, bringing with her a rare piece of comfort. She was an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair pinned neatly beneath a wide hat, and she had known Alina since she was a child. "You are frightened," Lady Camden said, taking Alina's hands in her own as they sat together in the drawing room. "That is only natural." "I do not know him at all," Alina admitted. "What if he is cruel? What if he despises me for taking a place he never wanted to give?" Lady Camden's expression softened. "Alexander is not cruel," she said. "He is guarded, yes. Since his father's passing, he has carried more weight than any young man should have to carry alone. But he is fair. He is honest. And he has agreed to this arrangement not out of selfishness, but because he wishes to protect the estate his family has cared for over generations. That is not the mark of a cruel man, Alina. That is the mark of a man who understands duty." Alina wanted to believe her. She held onto those words the way a sailor holds onto a rope during a storm, uncertain if it would truly hold, but grateful for something solid to grip in the chaos of her thoughts. On the morning of the wedding, Alina stood before her mirror as her maid fastened the final buttons of her gown. It was a beautiful dress, pale blue silk with delicate embroidery along the sleeves, chosen not out of joy but out of necessity, the finest garment her family could still afford to offer. She studied her reflection and hardly recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes looked older somehow, carrying a weight that had not been there a month before. "You look lovely, my lady," her maid said softly. Alina managed a small smile. "Thank you, Bridget. I only wish I felt as calm as I appear." "Perhaps calm will come with time," Bridget offered gently. "Many great things begin with uncertainty." Alina held onto that thought as she was helped into the carriage that would carry her to Ashworth Hall, to a church she had never seen, to a man she had never met, and to a life she could not yet imagine. The church itself was modest in size but grand in detail, with tall stone arches and stained glass windows that scattered colored light across the floor. Only a handful of guests were present, a small gathering suited to a wedding built on practicality rather than celebration. Alina's father walked her down the short aisle, his hand shaking slightly against her arm, though whether from grief or relief she could not tell. And there, standing at the altar, was the Duke of Ashworth. He was taller than she had imagined, with dark hair swept back neatly and sharp features that seemed carved rather than born. His eyes, a deep shade of gray, watched her approach with an expression she could not quite read, something between curiosity and careful distance. He wore his formal coat with the ease of a man accustomed to appearances, yet there was a stiffness in his shoulders that suggested he was no more comfortable with this moment than she was. When Alina reached him, he extended his hand and she placed hers within it. His grip was firm but not unkind. "Lady Hartley," he said quietly, his voice low and even, "thank you for agreeing to this." "Your Grace," she replied, matching his formal tone, though her heart raced beneath her calm exterior. The ceremony proceeded quickly, the words spoken by the clergyman feeling both solemn and strangely distant, as though Alina were watching the moment happen to someone else rather than living it herself. When the time came to exchange vows, Alexander's voice remained steady, professional, the words spoken with the precision of a man completing an important transaction rather than pledging his heart. Alina matched his tone as best she could, though her voice trembled slightly on the final words. When the clergyman pronounced them husband and wife, there was no embrace, no tender kiss shared between two people in love. Instead, Alexander offered her a polite nod, and Alina returned it, both of them acknowledging the strange new reality they had just entered together. Outside the church, the small gathering of guests offered quiet congratulations, though the atmosphere lacked the joyous energy typical of a wedding celebration. Alina's father embraced her tightly before she departed, whispering that he was proud of her courage, that she had saved them all. She held on to his words as the carriage pulled away from the church, carrying her toward Ashworth Hall and the unfamiliar life that awaited her there. The journey took nearly 2 hours, the countryside slowly shifting from the familiar hills of her childhood to grander, wilder landscapes she had never seen before. Alexander sat across from her for most of the ride, his attention fixed on papers he had brought along, occasionally glancing up to offer brief, polite comments about the passing scenery or the weather. Alina answered when spoken to, but mostly she watched the world outside the window, trying to steady the storm of emotions swirling within her. As the carriage finally crested a hill, Ashworth Hall came into view, and Alina could not stop the small gasp that escaped her lips. The estate was enormous, a sprawling structure of gray stone with towering windows and ivy climbing along its ancient walls. Gardens stretched out on either side, though many appeared neglected, overgrown in places where care had clearly been absent for some time. Despite its grandeur, there was a quiet sadness to the estate, as though the house itself missed the warmth of a family that once filled its halls with laughter. "It is beautiful," Alina said softly, unable to hide her genuine admiration. Alexander glanced toward the house, his expression unreadable. "It was once," he said. "Perhaps it will be again." The carriage came to a stop before the main entrance, where a line of servants had gathered to greet their new mistress. Alina stepped down from the carriage, smoothing her skirts as she took in the sight before her. The staff regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect, unsure, it seemed, of what to expect from their duke's new wife. An older woman with silver-streaked hair and kind but tired eyes stepped forward first. "Welcome to Ashworth Hall, Your Grace," she said with a warm smile. "I am Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper. We are honored to have you here." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield," Eleanor replied, offering a genuine smile in return. "I look forward to knowing you all." As the staff dispersed to their duties, Alexander led Eleanor into the grand entrance hall, where high ceilings and elegant staircases spoke of a family history rich with pride and tradition. Yet, despite its beauty, the house felt hollow, as though laughter had long since faded from its corridors. "Your rooms are prepared on the eastern wing," Alexander said, his tone formal once more. "Mrs. Whitfield will show you the way. I have matters to attend to this evening, but we will speak further tomorrow regarding the arrangement of this household." Eleanor nodded, understanding the unspoken message clearly enough. Their marriage may have been sealed by vows, but it remained, for now, nothing more than a practical agreement between two strangers. As she followed Mrs. Whitfield up the grand staircase, Eleanor allowed herself one final glance back toward the entrance hall, where Alexander stood alone, watching her go. For a brief moment, something flickered across his expression, something that resembled loneliness far more than indifference. Then he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the house, leaving Eleanor to wonder just what kind of man she had truly married. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed within an unfamiliar house, Eleanor stared up at the ornate ceiling above her and allowed herself, at last, to breathe. She had done what was necessary. Her family was safe. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her this far. Outside her window, the moon rose high over Ashworth Hall, casting silver light across gardens that had once known joy and might someday know it again. Morning came softly over Ashworth Hall, sunlight spilling through tall windows and painting golden lines across the polished wooden floors. Eleanor woke early, unused to the size of the bed, the silence of the halls, the strange feeling of being both a stranger and the mistress of a house all at once. She dressed quickly with the help of a young maid named Clara, who seemed eager to please but equally nervous, as though unsure how to behave around a new duchess who had arrived under such unusual circumstances. "Breakfast is served in the small dining room, Your Grace," Clara said, curtsying slightly. "His Grace usually takes his meal there before attending to estate matters." Eleanor thanked her and made her way down the wide staircase, her footsteps echoing faintly in the quiet corridors. The hall, though grand, felt strangely empty in the daylight, its beauty tinged with a sense of neglect. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, watching her pass with painted eyes that seemed to question her right to be there at all. She found the small dining room easily enough, though calling it small felt almost dishonest, for it was larger than the entire dining area of her childhood home. Alexander was already seated at the head of the table, a newspaper in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. He looked up briefly as she entered, offering a polite nod before returning his attention to the paper. "Good morning," Eleanor said, taking the seat offered to her by a footman. "Good morning," Alexander replied without looking up again. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Eleanor glanced around the room, taking in the elegant furnishings, the tall windows overlooking a garden badly in need of attention, and the empty chairs that seemed to speak of a family long absent. She wanted to ask questions about the house, about him, about what exactly was expected of her in this strange new life, but the words caught in her throat, uncertain of their welcome. Finally, she gathered her courage. "The gardens," she said carefully, "they must have been beautiful once." Alexander lowered his paper slightly, studying her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "They were," he said. "My mother tended them herself before she passed. No one has had the heart, or perhaps the time, to care for them since. I would be happy to help restore them if you do not object," Eleanor offered. "I have always found comfort in gardens." For a brief moment, something shifted in Alexander's expression, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even interest, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Do as you wish," he said simply. "The house is yours to manage as you see fit." It was not the warmest response, but Alina chose to take it as permission rather than dismissal. She finished her breakfast in relative silence, watching as Alexander eventually rose, folded his paper, and excused himself with a brief nod before disappearing toward his study, leaving her alone once more in the vast, quiet house. Over the following days, Alina threw herself into learning the rhythms of Ashworth Hall. She spent hours with Mrs. Whitfield, discussing the running of the household, the needs of the staff, and the various repairs long overdue throughout the estate. She found the housekeeper to be a wealth of knowledge, and more importantly, a source of genuine warmth in an otherwise cold and unfamiliar environment. "The master was not always so distant," Mrs. Whitfield confided one afternoon, as they walked together through the overgrown gardens, discussing which flowers might be salvaged and which needed to be replanted entirely. Before his father passed, before the weight of this estate fell upon his shoulders alone, he used to laugh quite often. He used to ride through these gardens as a boy, chasing after his mother, both of them laughing until the sun went down. Alina paused beside a cluster of wild roses, imagining a version of Alexander she had not yet seen, a boy full of joy rather than the guarded man who barely looked at her during meals. "What happened?" she asked softly. Mrs. Whitfield's expression grew somber. "His father grew ill not long after his mother's passing. The Duke was forced to manage the estate long before he was ready, long before any young man should carry such responsibility alone. Grief and duty have a way of hardening even the gentlest of hearts, Your Grace. I believe, somewhere beneath that careful distance, the boy who once laughed in these gardens still remains. He simply has not had reason to remember him in a very long time." Alina considered those words carefully as she continued walking through the garden, pulling weeds and clearing overgrown branches with her own hands, much to the surprise of the staff who had never seen a lady of noble birth engage in such labor herself. But Alina had never been one to sit idle while there was work to be done, and something about restoring life to this neglected garden felt deeply important, as though in doing so, she might also begin restoring something within the house itself. Days passed in this manner, Alina busy with the gardens and the household, Alexander occupied with matters of the estate that kept him locked away in his study for hours at a time. Their paths crossed mainly at meals, brief and formal exchanges that offered little insight into one another beyond the practical necessities of running a shared household. Yet Alina found herself increasingly curious about the man she had married, wondering what lay beneath his careful composure, what memories haunted the quiet moments when his guard seemed to slip, however briefly. One evening, unable to sleep, Alina wandered down to the library in search of a book that might quiet her restless mind. She had not expected to find Alexander there, seated near the fireplace with a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the flames with an expression of deep exhaustion. "Forgive me," Alina said quickly, startled by his presence. "I did not realize you were here. I only came for a book." "You need not apologize," Alexander replied, his voice softer than she had yet heard it. "This is your home now as much as it is mine." Alina hesitated, uncertain whether to retreat or remain. Something about the vulnerability in his tone drew her forward instead. "May I sit?" she asked. Alexander gestured toward the chair opposite him, and Alina settled into it carefully, the fire crackling softly between them. For a long moment neither spoke, the silence comfortable in a way their earlier exchanges had never been. "You have been working hard on the gardens," Alexander said eventually, breaking the quiet. "Mrs. Whitfield speaks of little else these days." Alina smiled faintly. "I find peace in growing things," she admitted. "There is something reassuring about tending to something broken and watching it slowly return to life." Alexander's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, something unreadable flickering behind his gray eyes. "My mother felt the same," he said quietly. She used to say that gardens teach patience better than any lesson a tutor could offer. She sounds as though she was a wise woman, Alina said gently. She was, Alexander replied, his voice carrying a rare note of warmth. I miss her greatly even now. Alina did not press further, sensing the fragile nature of the moment, but she allowed herself to simply exist in the quiet companionship they had found, however briefly, beside the fire. When Alexander finally rose to retire for the evening, he paused before leaving, turning back toward her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something close to gratitude. Thank you, he said simply, for the gardens, for bringing a little life back into this house. Before Alina could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone by the fire with her thoughts and a strange, unfamiliar warmth blooming quietly in her chest. The following weeks brought small changes, subtle but unmistakable. Alexander began joining Alina occasionally in the gardens during the late afternoon, offering brief but genuine conversation about the estate, about his childhood memories, about the family history embedded within the very walls of Ashworth Hall. Alina, in turn, found herself sharing more of her own past, her love for her younger brother, her fond memories of her mother, her fears and hopes for the future now so intricately tied to a man she was only beginning to understand. It was during one such afternoon, as they worked together to clear a particularly stubborn patch of overgrown ivy near the old stone fountain, that Alina first heard Alexander laugh, truly laugh, when a sudden gust of wind sent a shower of loose petals directly into his face, momentarily disrupting his usually composed demeanor. Alina could not help her own laughter at the sight, and for a brief, wonderful moment, the careful distance between them dissolved entirely, replaced by simple, unguarded joy. You find my misfortune amusing, I see, Alexander said, brushing petals from his dark hair, though his eyes carried unmistakable warmth rather than annoyance. Terribly amusing, Alina admitted, still smiling. I did not think the Duke of Ashworth capable of such an undignified expression. There are many things about me you do not yet know, Duchess, Alexander replied, a rare playful edge coloring his tone. Alina felt her heart flutter unexpectedly at his words, at the easy warmth now passing between them where cold formality had once stood. She was beginning to understand, slowly and carefully, that the man she had married out of necessity was far more complex, far more kind, and far more worthy of genuine affection than she had ever dared to hope. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Alina caught her own reflection in the mirror and noticed, with quiet surprise, the soft smile still lingering on her lips. Perhaps, she thought, this arrangement built on convenience might yet hold room for something far greater than either of them had anticipated. Outside her window, the restored garden glowed softly beneath the moonlight, roses blooming once more where neglect had long ruled, a quiet symbol of the slow, careful healing taking root within the walls of Ashworth Hall itself. A sharp knock at the study door pulled Alexander from his papers early one morning, and when he opened it, he found his estate manager standing there with a face drained of color, clutching a ledger book against his chest as though it might shield him from bad news. Your Grace, the man said, his voice unsteady, there is a serious problem with the eastern farms. The river has flooded 3 of the tenant fields overnight, and the grain stores in the lower village have been damaged beyond saving. If we cannot find a solution quickly, several families will have nothing to survive the coming winter. Alexander felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle heavily across his shoulders, the same weight he had carried since his father's passing, the same weight that had aged him beyond his years. Gather the details, he said. I will ride out within the hour. Alina, passing through the hallway on her way to the gardens, overheard enough of the conversation to understand the gravity of the situation. She stopped Alexander before he could leave, her expression full of concern rather than curiosity. What has happened? She asked. Alexander hesitated only a moment before explaining the situation, the flooded fields, the ruined grain stores, the tenant families who depended entirely on this year's harvest for their survival through the winter months ahead. Alina listened carefully, her mind already turning toward solutions rather than simply absorbing the weight of the problem. "I will come with you," she said firmly. "This is a state business," Alexander replied, though his tone lacked the sharpness such words might once have carried. "There is no need for you to trouble yourself." "These are our people now, are they not?" Eleanor countered gently but firmly. "If they suffer, it affects this household as much as it affects them. I would like to help if you will allow it." Alexander studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his gray eyes, an acknowledgement perhaps of the strength and determination he had begun to recognize within his wife. "Very well," he said finally. "Prepare yourself. We ride within the hour." The journey to the eastern farms revealed the full extent of the disaster. Fields that should have been golden with ready grain lay submerged beneath murky floodwater, and the village storehouse, once filled with enough provisions to see the tenants through the harshest winter months, now stood ruined, its contents soaked and spoiled beyond recovery. Villagers gathered along the muddy paths, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion, watching as their duke arrived to survey the wreckage of their livelihood. An older tenant farmer named Mr. Abbott approached first, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he addressed Alexander. "Your Grace, I do not know what we will do. Without that grain, my family and a dozen others will not survive the winter. We have nowhere else to turn." Alexander's jaw tightened, the weight of every villager's suffering settling onto his shoulders as though it were his own personal failure. "We will find a solution," he said, though his voice carried more determination than certainty. "I promise you that." As the tenants dispersed to salvage what little remained of their damaged stores, Eleanor moved quietly among them, offering words of comfort, listening carefully to their individual struggles, taking careful note of which families faced the most severe hardship. She noticed things Alexander, focused on broader estate concerns, had not yet considered: the elderly widow whose only son had left for work in the city, the young family with 3 small children and no reserves to draw upon, the injured farmhand unable to help rebuild due to a wounded leg. That evening, back within the walls of Ashworth Hall, Alexander paced his study restlessly, reviewing the estate's financial records in search of funds sufficient to purchase replacement grain and repair the damaged storehouse before winter fully set in. Eleanor found him there, hours after the household had otherwise settled for the night, his exhaustion evident in the deep lines etched across his forehead. "You have not eaten since this morning," she said gently, setting down a tray of food she had brought herself rather than sending a servant. Alexander looked up, surprised by her presence though grateful all the same. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not realize the hour." "You cannot solve this alone," Eleanor said, taking a seat across from his desk. "Allow me to help. 2 minds may find solutions one alone might miss." Alexander hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to sharing such burdens with anyone, let alone a wife he had married for practicality rather than partnership. But something in Eleanor's steady gaze convinced him to lower his guard, if only slightly. "The estate's reserves are limited," he admitted. "My father left significant debts of his own, hidden well enough that I did not discover their full extent until after his passing. Purchasing enough grain to replace what was lost, along with repairing the storehouse, will strain our finances considerably." Eleanor considered this carefully, her mind working through the problem with the same practical determination that had once saved her own family from ruin. "What if we did not purchase grain from outside merchants at inflated prices?" she suggested. "I noticed on our ride that the western fields, further from the flooding, still hold healthy crops nearing harvest. If we organize the tenants to assist one another, pooling resources and labor between the affected and unaffected farms, we might stretch what remains further than purchasing alone would allow." Alexander's eyes widened slightly, clearly impressed by the practicality of her suggestion. "That could work," he said slowly, turning the idea over in his mind. "If we also petition the merchants in town for reasonable prices rather than exploiting our misfortune, we might yet manage without pushing the estate further into debt." "I could speak with the merchants myself," Eleanor offered. Sometimes a woman's approach yields different results than a duke's formal request. Alexander studied her for a long moment, something warm and genuine shining behind his tired eyes. "You continue to surprise me, Alina," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time since their wedding day. The sound of her name spoken so gently sent an unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. "I only wish to help," she said softly. "This is my home now too. Its people are my responsibility as much as yours." Over the following days, Alina and Alexander worked together with a shared purpose neither had anticipated when they first entered their arrangement. Alina visited the merchants in town personally, her calm sincerity and genuine concern for the tenant families softening even the most stubborn negotiators, securing grain at prices far more reasonable than Alexander had expected possible. Meanwhile, Alexander organized the tenants themselves, coordinating labor between the unaffected western farms and the flooded eastern fields, ensuring the entire community worked together rather than each family struggling alone against an impossible burden. The physical labor proved exhausting for everyone involved, but Alina found herself surprisingly capable, rolling up her sleeves alongside the village women to help repair the damaged storehouse, her noble upbringing set aside entirely in favor of practical assistance. Alexander often paused during his own labor to watch her, a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, growing steadily within him. One particularly difficult afternoon, as they worked together to reinforce the storehouse walls against future flooding, a sudden downpour caught them both unprepared, soaking through their clothes within minutes. Rather than retreating immediately for shelter, Alina laughed at the absurdity of their situation, tilting her face upward toward the rain with an expression of pure, unguarded joy. "You are entirely soaked through," Alexander observed, though his own smile betrayed his amusement rather than concern. "As are you," Alina countered playfully. "Perhaps we should simply accept our fate and finish the wall regardless." Alexander laughed then, a genuine hearty sound Alina had rarely heard from him, and together they continued their work despite the rain, both soaked through yet strangely content in the shared labor and unexpected joy of the moment. When they finally returned to the shelter of a nearby barn, breathless and laughing, Alexander helped Alina remove her sodden outer coat, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary against her shoulders. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice suddenly serious despite the playful mood only moments before. "For everything you have done these past days. I did not expect such dedication from you, Alina. I confess, I did not expect much of anything when this arrangement began." Alina met his gaze steadily, her heart racing at the sincerity in his tone. "Nor did I," she admitted honestly. "But I find myself growing quite fond of this life we are building together, Alexander." The use of his given name, spoken so gently, seemed to affect him deeply, his careful composure slipping further than she had yet witnessed. For a brief, charged moment neither spoke, the space between them heavy with unspoken possibility. But the moment passed, interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Abbott seeking further instructions, and both retreated once more into their respective roles, though something between them had undeniably shifted. By the end of the following week, through careful planning, shared labor, and genuine cooperation between the estate and its tenants, the crisis had been largely resolved. The storehouse stood rebuilt and stronger than before, sufficient grain secured to see every family safely through the winter ahead, and a renewed sense of unity settled over the entire estate, tenants and nobility alike having weathered the disaster together rather than divided by class and circumstance. At a small gathering held in the village to celebrate their success, Mr. Abbott raised a humble toast in honor of the Duke and Duchess, praising not only their generosity but their willingness to labor alongside the very people they served. Alina felt tears prick at her eyes as the villagers cheered, not for a distant, untouchable nobility, but for two people who had proven themselves genuine partners in their community's survival. Later that evening, as they rode back toward Ashworth Hall beneath a sky brilliant with stars, Alexander broke the comfortable silence between them. "I have never felt more grateful for an arrangement I once considered purely practical," he admitted quietly. "You have brought something to this estate I did not realize was missing, Eleanor. Something I fear I had forgotten how to hope for." Eleanor's heart swelled at his words, warmth spreading through her chest despite the cool night air surrounding them. "Perhaps," she said softly, "convenience was simply the beginning neither of us expected to lead somewhere far more meaningful." Alexander glanced toward her, moonlight illuminating the soft, genuine smile now gracing his features, a smile Eleanor was quickly coming to treasure above almost anything else in her new life. Neither spoke further, but the silence between them now carried none of the cold formality that had once defined their marriage. Instead, it held something new, something fragile yet undeniably real, growing steadily stronger with each passing day they spent together. As Ashworth Hall came into view once more, its windows glowing warmly against the darkening sky, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time since her wedding day, to imagine a future built not merely on obligation, but on genuine partnership, respect, and perhaps, if fate proved kind, something even deeper still. Autumn settled gently over Ashworth Hall, painting the restored gardens in shades of amber and gold. And with the changing season came a quiet rhythm to Eleanor and Alexander's days that neither had anticipated when their marriage first began. Breakfast, once a silent and formal affair, had grown into a comfortable ritual of easy conversation, Alexander sharing stories of the estate's history, Eleanor recounting memories of her childhood with a warmth that never failed to draw genuine laughter from him. It was during one such breakfast that Alexander suggested, almost hesitantly, that Eleanor accompany him on his weekly ride to inspect the northern boundary of the estate. "The view from the ridge is worth the journey," he said, his tone carrying none of the guarded formality that had once defined every exchange between them. "I think you would appreciate it." Eleanor agreed eagerly, and within the hour they set out together on horseback, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Eleanor had always loved riding, and she found herself matching Alexander's pace easily, the two of them moving in comfortable silence through fields and forests that stretched further than she had realized the estate encompassed. When they reached the ridge Alexander had promised, Eleanor understood immediately why he had wanted to share it with her. The land stretched out before them in every direction, rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, the entire valley bathed in the soft golden light of late afternoon. It was breathtaking in a way that words could hardly capture, and Eleanor found herself simply standing in silence, absorbing the beauty of the view. "It is magnificent," she finally said, glancing toward Alexander, who was watching her reaction rather than the view itself. "I used to come here often as a boy," he admitted, dismounting to stand beside her. "My mother would bring me during difficult times, whenever the weight of the world felt too heavy to bear. She always said the view reminded her that even the largest problems seemed small against something so vast and enduring." Eleanor turned to face him fully, sensing an opening into the deeper parts of himself he rarely allowed others to see. "You rarely speak of your parents," she observed gently. "I would like to know more, if you are willing to share." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon rather than on her, though Eleanor could see the internal struggle playing across his features, the careful walls he had built over years of loss and responsibility slowly beginning to crack. "My mother died when I was 16, he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "A fever took her quickly, far too quickly for any of us to properly prepare. My father was never quite the same afterward. He grew distant, buried himself entirely in estate matters, as though avoiding the pain of her absence by filling every waking moment with duty instead." "That must have been incredibly difficult," Eleanor said softly, moving closer to stand beside him. "It was," Alexander admitted. "I lost both parents that day in a sense, my mother to death and my father to grief. By the time he passed 3 years ago, we were practically strangers, bound only by obligation rather than affection. I inherited not only his estate but his fear of vulnerability, his belief that duty must always come before feeling." He paused, finally turning to meet Eleanor's gaze directly. I did not expect, when I entered this marriage, to feel anything beyond practical necessity. I certainly did not expect to find myself caring for the woman I married so quickly, so completely. Eleanor's breath caught at his words, her heart racing as she processed the vulnerability he had just offered her, a gift far more precious than any material wealth Ashworth Hall might provide. I did not expect it either, she admitted, her own voice trembling slightly with the honesty of the moment. I entered this marriage believing I was sacrificing any hope of genuine happiness for the sake of my family's survival. Instead, I find myself falling for a man I once thought I would never truly know. The words hung between them, fragile and honest, neither quite certain how to proceed now that such feelings had finally been spoken aloud. Alexander reached out slowly, his hand gently brushing a loose strand of hair from Eleanor's face, his touch careful and reverent, as though she were something precious he feared might disappear if handled too roughly. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I know this marriage began as nothing more than a practical arrangement, but I find myself hoping, quite desperately, that it might yet become something far greater." Eleanor leaned slightly into his touch, her own hand rising to rest gently against his. "I hope for the same thing, Alexander," she whispered. For a long, breathless moment, neither moved, the world around them fading into insignificance against the weight of their shared confession. But before either could act further on the growing warmth between them, a sudden gust of wind swept across the ridge, breaking the spell just enough for practical sensibility to return. Alexander stepped back slightly, though his expression remained soft, his gray eyes warmer than Eleanor had ever seen them. "We should return before the light fades entirely," he said, though his tone carried reluctance rather than genuine urgency. Eleanor nodded, and together they mounted their horses once more, riding back toward Ashworth Hall in a silence that felt entirely different from the guarded silences of their earlier days together. This silence was warm, comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding rather than careful distance. Over the following weeks, their relationship continued to deepen steadily, small moments of genuine connection, accumulating like stones, building a sturdy bridge between two hearts that had once been strangers. Alexander began seeking Eleanor's company more openly, inviting her to join him for evening walks through the restored gardens, sharing quiet conversations by the library fire that stretched long into the night. Eleanor, in turn, found herself sharing parts of her own past she had rarely spoken of before, her fears of inadequacy, her worry that she might never live up to the responsibilities now placed upon her as Duchess. "You worry too much about proving yourself," Alexander told her one evening as they sat together by the fire, the flames casting warm light across the library's tall bookshelves. "You have already proven yourself far beyond what I expected, Eleanor. The tenants adore you, the staff respect you, and he paused, his voice growing softer, "I find myself thinking of you constantly, wondering what you are doing, hoping for the moments we share together." Eleanor's heart swelled at his admission, warmth spreading through her chest at the sincerity evident in his tone. "I think of you too," she confessed, "more than I ever expected to, given how our marriage began." Alexander reached for her hand across the small distance separating them, his fingers intertwining gently with hers. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "we were fortunate in the end that necessity brought us together. I do not think I would have found you otherwise, not in the circles I typically moved within before your father's letter arrived." "Fate has strange ways of working," Eleanor agreed softly, her thumb tracing gentle patterns against his hand. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, the fire slowly burning lower, neither willing to break the peaceful intimacy of the moment. When Eleanor finally rose to retire for the evening, Alexander walked her to the base of the staircase, his expression carrying a warmth entirely absent from the cold formality of their wedding day months before. "Good night, Eleanor," he said softly, raising her hand gently to press a light kiss against her knuckles, a small gesture that nonetheless sent warmth spreading rapidly through her entire body. "Good night, Alexander," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart racing as she made her way up the stairs, glancing back once to find him still watching her with an expression of unmistakable affection. As autumn deepened further into the coming winter months, Ashworth Hall itself seemed to transform alongside its master and mistress. Warmth returning to halls that had long stood cold and empty, laughter echoing once more through corridors that had known only silence for far too long. The staff noticed the change immediately, whispering amongst themselves with quiet delight at the obvious affection growing steadily between their Duke and Duchess. A marriage that had begun as mere convenience slowly, unmistakably, blossoming into something far more precious. Yet even as their bond deepened, a quiet uncertainty lingered at the edges of Aline's happiness, an awareness that such joy, so unexpectedly found, might prove fragile against whatever challenges still lay ahead. She pushed the worry aside as best she could, choosing instead to embrace each precious moment shared with Alexander, uncertain of what the future held, but increasingly certain of the growing love now blossoming steadily within her own heart. Little did she know that fragile happiness would soon face its greatest test yet, as a figure from Alexander's past prepared to return, threatening to unravel everything they had so carefully built together. The invitation arrived on a cold morning in early winter, delivered by a liveried messenger who insisted it be placed directly into the Duke's hands. Aline watched from across the breakfast table as Alexander broke the wax seal, his expression shifting subtly as he read the contents, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features before he carefully composed himself once more. "What is it?" Aline asked, curious at the sudden change in his demeanor. "An invitation," Alexander said, folding the letter and setting it aside. "Lord and Lady Pemberton are hosting a winter gathering at their estate next week. Most of the county's nobility will be in attendance." "That sounds lovely," Aline replied, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the matter than a simple social gathering. Alexander hesitated before continuing. "Lady Victoria Pemberton will be present as well," he said carefully. "She and I were close some years ago before circumstances separated us." Aline felt a small knot form in her stomach at his words, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I see," she said simply. "It was a long time ago," Alexander added quickly, perhaps sensing her unease. "There is nothing between us now beyond old acquaintance." Aline nodded, though the seed of doubt had already been planted, however small. "Of course," she said, offering a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "It will be good to meet more of the county's society." The days leading up to the gathering passed with an undercurrent of tension neither Aline nor Alexander directly acknowledged, though both felt it lingering beneath their usual warmth. Aline found herself wondering about this Lady Victoria, imagining a woman of great beauty and charm, someone who had known Alexander long before circumstance and duty had brought Aline into his life. She tried to push such thoughts aside, reminding herself of the genuine affection that had grown between them these past months, but the uncertainty remained, quiet but persistent. When the evening of the gathering finally arrived, Aline dressed with particular care, choosing an elegant gown of deep emerald silk that Alexander had gifted her only weeks before, hoping perhaps that looking her best might ease the quiet anxiety settling in her chest. As they arrived at the Pemberton estate, grand and brightly lit against the winter darkness, Aline took Alexander's arm, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. The gathering itself was a dazzling affair, the great hall filled with the county's finest families, music drifting through the air as couples danced beneath glittering chandeliers. Aline found herself introduced to countless faces, names blurring together as she attempted to navigate the unfamiliar social landscape of Alexander's world. Yet despite the warmth of the evening, she remained acutely aware of a particular woman across the room, a striking figure in a gown of deep crimson, her golden hair perfectly arranged, her eyes occasionally drifting toward Alexander with an intensity Aline could not ignore. "That is Lady Victoria," Alexander confirmed quietly, noticing the direction of Aline's gaze. Before Aline could respond, the woman in question approached them directly, a confident smile gracing her features as she addressed Alexander with obvious familiarity. "Alexander," she said warmly, "it has been far too long." "Victoria," Alexander replied, his tone polite but carefully measured. "This is my wife, Eleanor, Duchess of Ashworth." Victoria's gaze shifted toward Eleanor, her smile remaining fixed though something calculating flickered briefly behind her eyes. "A pleasure," she said smoothly, though her tone carried a subtle edge Eleanor could not quite define. "I had heard Alexander finally married. How wonderfully sudden it all was it not? Practically overnight, if the rumors are to be believed." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at the poorly veiled implication, though she maintained her composure carefully. "Circumstances brought us together quickly," she replied evenly, "though I have found the arrangement to suit us both remarkably well." Victoria's smile sharpened slightly at Eleanor's steady response, though she quickly redirected her attention toward Alexander instead. "You must save me a dance for old time's sake," she said, her tone light but her meaning clear enough. "We have so much catching up to do." Alexander glanced briefly toward Eleanor before responding. "Perhaps later," he said diplomatically, though Eleanor noted he had not outright refused. The evening continued, and Eleanor found herself watching, with growing unease, as Victoria seemed to find countless opportunities to draw Alexander into conversation, her laughter carrying across the room each time she succeeded in capturing his attention, however briefly. Eleanor tried to remain composed, engaging in conversation with other guests, yet her attention remained divided, an uncomfortable knot of jealousy and insecurity growing steadily within her chest, despite her best efforts to dismiss such feelings as unfounded. Later in the evening, as the musicians struck up another song, Eleanor watched with a sinking heart as Victoria approached Alexander once more, this time extending her hand expectantly for the promised dance. Alexander glanced toward Eleanor, a silent question in his eyes, and Eleanor, unwilling to create a scene in such a public setting, offered a small nod of permission, though every part of her wished she could refuse. She watched from across the room as Alexander led Victoria onto the dance floor, the two of them moving together with an ease that spoke of genuine familiarity, of shared history Eleanor had no part in. Victoria leaned close during the dance, whispering something into Alexander's ear that drew a small, reluctant smile from him, and Eleanor felt her heart clench painfully at the sight, doubt and insecurity flooding through her despite every rational thought reminding her of the affection Alexander had shown her these past months. "They make a striking pair, do they not?" a voice commented beside her, and Eleanor turned to find an older woman watching the dance with obvious interest. "Everyone expected Alexander to marry Victoria, you know, before his father's passing complicated matters. Quite the scandal when the engagement was quietly called off." Eleanor's breath caught at this new information. "They were engaged?" she asked, unable to hide the surprise in her voice. The woman nodded, seemingly unaware of the distress her words were causing. "Oh yes, quite seriously too, from what I understand, though the details of why it ended remain something of a mystery. Some say it was his father's doing, others suggest Victoria herself grew impatient waiting for him to settle his family affairs before proceeding with marriage. Regardless, it seems old feelings may not have entirely faded, judging by tonight's display." Eleanor felt sick with a combination of jealousy, insecurity, and betrayal at learning such significant history from a stranger rather than from Alexander himself. Why had he not mentioned an actual engagement, rather than simply describing Victoria as an old acquaintance? What else might he be keeping from her? By the time Alexander returned to her side following the dance, Eleanor's earlier warmth had cooled considerably, replaced by a careful distance she could not quite disguise. "Eleanor," Alexander said, noticing immediately the shift in her demeanor, "is something wrong?" "I did not realize you were once engaged to Lady Victoria," Eleanor said, keeping her voice low but unable to fully mask the hurt evident within it. Alexander's expression shifted to one of surprise, followed quickly by understanding. "Eleanor, that was years ago, long before circumstances with my father's health complicated everything. It ended for reasons that no longer matter. Yet you danced with her tonight as though those years had never passed, Alina countered, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts at composure. It was simply a dance, Alexander said, though his tone carried a defensive edge that did little to ease Alina's growing distress. I did not wish to create an unnecessary scene by refusing her in front of half the county's nobility. Perhaps you should have considered how such a scene might appear to your own wife instead, Alina replied, her voice sharper than she intended, though the hurt beneath her words remained painfully evident. Alexander's expression hardened slightly, frustration mixing with confusion at her reaction. Alina, there is truly nothing between Victoria and myself any longer. I do not understand why this troubles you so deeply. Perhaps because you did not think it important enough to mention, Alina said quietly, that the woman you danced with so easily tonight was once meant to be your wife. The remainder of the evening passed with strained politeness between them, the earlier warmth of their relationship replaced by an uncomfortable distance neither seemed able to fully bridge. The carriage ride home was largely silent, both lost in their own thoughts, the earlier joy of the evening now tainted by unresolved hurt and misunderstanding. Over the following days, the careful warmth that had grown so steadily between Alina and Alexander seemed to retreat, replaced once more by the polite formality that had characterized the earliest days of their marriage. Alexander, uncertain how to bridge the sudden distance without further upsetting Alina, retreated into the safety of a state business, spending long hours in his study rather than seeking her company as he had grown accustomed to doing. Alina, meanwhile, threw herself once more into managing the household and gardens, using constant activity as a shield against the painful uncertainty now clouding her heart. Rumors, unfortunately, have a way of spreading through county society regardless of truth or context, and it was not long before whispers began circulating that the Duke of Ashworth's marriage was already troubled, that old feelings for Lady Victoria Pemberton had resurfaced following their reunion at the winter gathering. Alina heard such whispers second-hand through Mrs. Whitfield, who reported them with obvious reluctance, clearly wishing to spare her mistress further distress. "Pay them no mind, your grace," Mrs. Whitfield urged gently, finding Alina alone in the garden one particularly cold afternoon, wrapped in a heavy shawl against the winter chill. "Idle gossip rarely reflects genuine truth." "Perhaps," Alina replied softly, though doubt continued to gnaw at her heart despite the housekeeper's kind reassurance. "Yet I cannot help wondering if there is truth hidden somewhere within the rumors nonetheless." As if summoned by Alina's very doubts, a letter arrived only days later, delivered directly to Alina rather than through official household channels, its handwriting elegant and clearly feminine. Alina's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, her heart sinking further as she read the contents. The letter was from Victoria herself, its tone deceptively friendly on the surface, yet carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of triumph and manipulation. Victoria wrote of her enduring affection for Alexander, of shared memories from their courtship that Alina could never hope to understand or replicate, and closed with a veiled suggestion that Alexander's current marriage, however practical, could hardly compete with the genuine love they had once shared. Alina set the letter down with trembling hands, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes despite her determination to remain composed. Doubt, insecurity, and heartbreak warred within her, threatening to undo the fragile happiness she had only recently allowed herself to embrace. Had she been foolish to believe Alexander's affection genuine? Was their entire relationship destined to remain forever shadowed by a love that had come before her, a love perhaps far deeper than anything she herself could offer? That evening, unable to face Alexander directly with such raw uncertainty still churning within her, Alina retreated early to her chambers, choosing solitude over the painful possibility of confirming her deepest fears. She did not yet know that Alexander, sensing the growing distance between them and desperate to understand its cause, had already begun seeking answers of his own, unaware of the letter that had so thoroughly shaken his wife's fragile trust. The misunderstanding, born of unspoken history and unfortunate timing, threatened now to unravel everything the two of them had so carefully built together these past months, and neither yet possessed the clarity needed to see the truth clearly through the fog of doubt and old rumors clouding their path forward. Winter tightened its grip over Ashworth Hall in the days that followed, the cold outside seeming to mirror the growing distance settling between its Duke and Duchess. Alina kept Victoria's letter hidden away in her writing desk, unable to bring herself to confront Alexander directly with its contents, yet equally unable to dismiss the doubts it had planted so effectively within her heart. Their meals together grew increasingly quiet, the easy warmth of recent months replaced by careful politeness that felt, to Alina, disturbingly similar to the coldness of their earliest days together. Alexander, for his part, remained largely unaware of the letter's existence, though he could not fail to notice the change in Alina's demeanor toward him. He attributed her withdrawal to lingering hurt over the dance with Victoria, and while he understood her frustration to some degree, he found himself growing increasingly frustrated by her continued distance, uncertain how to bridge a gap he did not fully comprehend. "Alina," he said one evening, finding her alone in the library, staring into the fire with an expression of quiet sadness she quickly attempted to mask upon his entrance. "We have barely spoken these past days. Have I done something further to upset you?" Alina hesitated, torn between confronting him directly with the letter and her fears, or continuing to retreat into silent uncertainty. Pride and hurt won out over honesty in that moment, and she offered only a careful, guarded response instead. "I am simply tired, Alexander. The winter season brings much additional work to the household." Alexander studied her closely, clearly unconvinced by her explanation, though he chose not to press further, sensing her reluctance to discuss whatever truly troubled her. "Very well," he said quietly, though disappointment was evident in his tone as he retreated from the library, leaving Alina alone once more with her doubts and the letter still hidden within her desk. The following week brought further complications when Victoria herself arrived unannounced at Ashworth Hall, claiming urgent business regarding a charitable committee she and Alexander had apparently once organized together before his father's illness had forced him to abandon such social obligations. Alina, caught entirely off guard by the unexpected visit, greeted Victoria with careful, practiced courtesy, though every instinct screamed against the false warmth required by proper etiquette. "Duchess Alina," Victoria greeted her with a smile that did not reach her calculating eyes. "I do hope you do not mind my sudden intrusion. Alexander and I have unfinished business regarding the winter charity gathering, matters I felt too urgent to delay through formal correspondence alone." "Of course," Alina replied, her tone carefully neutral despite the turmoil churning beneath her composed exterior. "I will have Alexander informed of your arrival immediately." As Victoria was shown into the drawing room to await Alexander, Alina found herself lingering nearby, unable to fully retreat despite every rational instinct urging her toward distance, rather than proximity to a situation clearly designed to cause her distress. She overheard fragments of conversation as Alexander joined Victoria shortly after, their voices carrying faintly through the partially open door. "You seem troubled, Alexander," Victoria's voice drifted through the gap, laced with practiced concern. "Marriage does not appear to suit you as well as I might have hoped." "Victoria, please," Alexander's voice replied, tension evident even through the muffled distance. "Whatever business you claim regarding the charity committee, let us address it quickly. I have little patience remaining for anything beyond that today." "Such hostility," Victoria replied, her tone shifting subtly toward something softer, more intimate. "I only wish to help, Alexander. I can see quite clearly that something troubles you deeply. Perhaps if things had proceeded differently between us years ago, you would not now find yourself burdened by such obvious unhappiness." Alina's heart clenched painfully at these words, unable to hear Alexander's immediate response through the growing distance as she retreated further from the drawing-room door. unwilling to torture herself further with a conversation clearly designed to manipulate rather than genuinely assist with charitable matters. She made her way instead to the gardens, seeking solitude among the winter-bare roses she had worked so hard to restore, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks as the weight of her doubts and fears overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. She did not witness Alexander firmly ending the conversation shortly after, clearly recognizing Victoria's manipulative intentions, and dismissing her with a politeness that nonetheless left no room for misunderstanding regarding his complete lack of interest in rekindling anything beyond the most basic acquaintance. Nor did she witness his growing concern as he searched the house afterward, seeking a leaner to address whatever troubled her so deeply, only to find her absent from her usual haunts within the hall itself. It was Mrs. Whitfield who eventually located Alina in the gardens, finding her mistress seated on a cold stone bench despite the winter chill, her expression carrying obvious distress the housekeeper could not ignore. "Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said gently, settling beside her despite the impropriety of such familiarity, "whatever troubles you, please know you need not carry it alone." Alina, comforted by the older woman's genuine kindness, finally allowed the full weight of her fears to spill forth, explaining the letter, the overheard conversation, the growing doubt that perhaps Alexander's heart remained tethered to a love that had existed long before Alina herself entered his life. Mrs. Whitfield listened patiently throughout, her expression growing increasingly troubled as Alina's account continued. "Your Grace," she said finally, once Alina had finished, "I have served this family for many years, long enough to know Lady Victoria's character quite well. She is not, I fear, entirely honest in her intentions. There were whispers, years ago, suggesting she ended her engagement to the master not from any genuine change of heart, but rather because she grew unwilling to wait through the difficulties surrounding his father's illness. She sought a match that offered immediate security rather than uncertain devotion. I would not trust her words regarding the master's true feelings, not for a moment." Alina absorbed this information carefully, a small flicker of hope kindling within her despite the lingering doubt still clouding her heart. Then why would she write such a letter now, so long after their engagement ended? "Perhaps," Mrs. Whitfield suggested thoughtfully, "she has grown jealous, witnessing the genuine happiness you and the master have built together these past months. Sometimes those who once discarded something precious grow desperate to reclaim it, particularly upon witnessing another finding true joy where they themselves once failed to recognize its value." Alina considered this possibility carefully, though uncertainty still lingered within her heart. "I fear I have handled this poorly," she admitted quietly. "Rather than speaking honestly with Alexander regarding my doubts, I retreated into silence and distance instead, likely causing him confusion and hurt of his own." "It is never too late to speak honestly, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield encouraged gently. "The master cares for you deeply, that much I have witnessed with my own eyes these past months. Whatever misunderstanding has grown between you, I have no doubt it can be resolved through honest conversation, should you find the courage to pursue it." Alina returned to the house shortly after, determined to finally confront the situation directly rather than allowing doubt and pride to continue, eroding the precious relationship she had built with Alexander. Yet fate, unfortunately, seemed determined to complicate matters further, for as she made her way toward Alexander's study, she encountered him already emerging, his expression troubled and his manner distracted. "Alina," he said, clearly relieved to find her, though his relief quickly shifted toward concern upon noticing her tear-stained cheeks and evident distress. "What has happened? You look as though you have been crying." Before Alina could respond, a servant interrupted urgently, informing Alexander of pressing estate business, requiring his immediate attention in town. A legal matter regarding boundary disputes that could not be delayed without significant consequence to the estate's holdings. Alexander hesitated, clearly torn between his urgent duty and his obvious concern for Alina's evident distress. "Go," Alina urged quietly, though every part of her wished desperately for him to remain instead. We will speak when you return. This matter cannot wait, I understand that much. Alexander studied her closely, clearly reluctant to leave matters unresolved between them, yet equally aware of his responsibility toward the estate and its many dependents. I will return as quickly as possible, he promised, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead before departing hastily toward town, leaving Alina alone once more with her unresolved fears and doubts. What neither of them yet knew was that Victoria, sensing an opportunity within the obvious tension now visible between the Duke and Duchess, had already set additional plans into motion, determined to exploit the fragile uncertainty still lingering at the edges of their relationship. As Alexander departed for town, Victoria's own carriage arrived once more at Ashworth Hall, timed with a precision that suggested careful planning rather than mere coincidence. Alina, exhausted both emotionally and physically from the day's turmoil, was in no state to face Victoria's calculated visit, yet found herself with little choice as the woman insisted upon being received despite Alexander's absence. I understand Alexander has been called away rather urgently, Victoria said, settling into the drawing room with a confidence that bordered on ownership rather than mere guest status. Perhaps it is fortunate timing, allowing us the opportunity to speak more candidly than propriety might otherwise allow. I fail to see what further conversation between us might accomplish, Alina replied, her exhaustion lending an edge of directness to her words she might otherwise have carefully avoided. Victoria's expression shifted subtly, her earlier calculated warmth replaced by something colder, more honest in its calculated cruelty. I simply wish you to understand the truth of the situation, Duchess. Alexander and I shared something genuine, something built over years of true understanding between us, long before circumstance and desperation brought you into his life. Your marriage, however pleasant you may have convinced yourself it has become, remains fundamentally an arrangement of convenience. Such foundations rarely withstand the test of true love when it resurfaces. Alina felt anger rising within her now, overtaking the earlier fear and doubt that had plagued her these past difficult days. Whatever existed between you and Alexander clearly was not strong enough to withstand the difficulties life presented you both, she replied evenly, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath her calm exterior. You chose to abandon him during his greatest time of need, is that not correct? Perhaps true love, as you claim to understand it, requires rather more loyalty and sacrifice than you yourself proved willing to offer. Victoria's composure cracked visibly at Alina's pointed words, her earlier confidence faltering into something closer to genuine anger. You know nothing of what truly transpired between us, she snapped, her carefully maintained facade slipping entirely away. Perhaps not, Alina replied calmly, rising from her seat with newfound resolve despite the emotional exhaustion still weighing heavily upon her. But I know enough to trust in what Alexander and I have built together these past months, a foundation grown not from convenience alone, but from genuine partnership, respect, and yes, love, however unexpectedly it arrived. I believe it is time for you to leave, Lady Victoria. Victoria departed shortly after, her earlier confidence thoroughly shaken by Alina's unexpected strength and clarity, though the seeds of doubt she had so carefully planted still lingered within Alina's heart, despite her outward display of confidence. Alone once more within the quiet halls of Ashworth Hall, Alina allowed herself finally to acknowledge the full truth of her feelings, recognizing clearly now that whatever misunderstanding had grown between herself and Alexander stemmed not from any genuine failing in their relationship, but rather from her own fear of vulnerability, her own reluctance to trust fully in a happiness she still, on some level, feared she did not deserve. As evening fell and Alexander's return grew increasingly overdue, Alina made a decision. She would wait no longer, hiding behind pride and unspoken doubt. When Alexander returned, regardless of the hour, she would finally speak honestly with him, sharing every fear, every doubt, trusting fully in the genuine love she now recognized clearly blooming within her own heart, whatever risk such vulnerability might carry. Yet as the hours stretched later into the night without any sign of Alexander's return, a new worry began to replace her earlier resolve. A growing concern that something beyond simple business delays might now be keeping her husband from home. Snow had begun falling heavily by the time Eleanor's worry transformed into genuine alarm, thick white flakes, accumulating rapidly across the darkened grounds of Ashworth Hall, obscuring the road that led toward town where Alexander had departed hours earlier. She paced the entrance hall restlessly, glancing repeatedly toward the tall windows, searching desperately for any sign of approaching carriage lights through the swirling storm outside. "Your Grace, perhaps you should rest," Mrs. Whitfield suggested gently, though her own expression carried visible concern that did little to reassure Eleanor. "The master is likely simply delayed by the weather. The roads grow treacherous quickly during such sudden storms." "I cannot rest until I know he is safe," Eleanor replied, her voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Please send word to the stables. I wish to know if any of the men might ride out to search the road toward town." Before Mrs. Whitfield could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from outside, followed quickly by urgent pounding against the great entrance doors. Eleanor rushed forward herself, her heart pounding painfully as a footman threw open the doors to reveal one of the estate's stable hands, breathless and covered in snow, his expression grave with urgent news. "Your Grace," the young man gasped, struggling to catch his breath, "there has been an accident along the northern road. His Grace's carriage struck a fallen tree during the storm. The driver managed to send word ahead, but His Grace was injured in the crash." Eleanor felt the world tilt dangerously beneath her feet, fear gripping her chest with such intensity she could barely draw breath. "How badly injured?" she demanded, already reaching for her heaviest coat despite the raging storm outside. "I do not know the full extent, Your Grace," the stable hand admitted. "Only that he struck his head and remains unconscious. They are bringing him back now, though the roads are treacherous with the snow." "Prepare the fastest horse," Eleanor commanded, her earlier hurt and doubt regarding Victoria's manipulations utterly forgotten in the face of far greater fear. "I am riding out to meet them." "Your Grace, the storm," Mrs. Whitfield began to protest. "I cannot simply wait here while Alexander lies injured somewhere along that road," Eleanor interrupted firmly, her earlier vulnerability replaced now by fierce determination. "Please, help me prepare quickly." Despite considerable protest from the household staff, Eleanor's resolve remained unshaken, and within minutes she found herself mounted upon a sturdy horse, riding out into the blinding snowstorm alongside two of the estate's most capable men, following the stable hand's directions toward the site of the accident. The journey proved treacherous, visibility reduced to mere feet in every direction, the cold biting fiercely through her heavy coat, yet Eleanor pressed forward with single-minded determination, fear for Alexander's safety overriding every other consideration. They found the wrecked carriage nearly an hour later, tilted precariously against the massive fallen tree that had blocked the narrow road, its driver working frantically alongside two other men to free Alexander from where he remained trapped within the damaged vehicle. Eleanor dismounted quickly, rushing forward despite the continued warnings of her escorts, her heart breaking at the sight of Alexander's still form, a dark stain of blood visible against his temple where he had struck his head during the crash. "Alexander!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside him as the men finally succeeded in freeing him from the wreckage, carefully lowering him onto a blanket spread across the snow-covered ground. "Alexander, please wake up." His eyes remained closed, his breathing shallow but steady, offering Eleanor at least some small measure of relief amid her overwhelming fear. She pressed her hands gently against the wound at his temple, using a strip of cloth torn from her own coat to stem the bleeding as best she could while the men worked quickly to prepare an alternative means of transporting him safely back toward Ashworth Hall. The journey home felt endless, Eleanor riding alongside the makeshift stretcher upon which Alexander had been carefully placed, her hand never leaving his despite the biting cold and treacherous conditions surrounding them. She spoke to him continuously throughout the journey, uncertain whether he could hear her words, yet unwilling to remain silent regardless. "Please, Alexander," she whispered, tears freezing against her cheeks in the frigid night air, "please wake up. I have so much I need to tell you. I was foolish, so foolish, to let doubt and pride keep me from speaking honestly with you these past days. I love you, Alexander. I have loved you for weeks now, though fear kept me from admitting it even to myself. Please do not leave me now, not when I have finally found the courage to say it." By the time they finally reached Ashworth Hall, the household staff had already prepared everything necessary for the physician's arrival: warm water, clean bandages, a roaring fire in Alexander's chambers to combat the deep chill that had settled into his unconscious body during the long journey home. Alina remained by his bedside throughout the physician's examination, gripping his hand tightly as the doctor carefully cleaned and dressed the wound at his temple, expressing cautious optimism regarding Alexander's condition, despite the concerning length of his continued unconsciousness. "The wound itself is not severe," the physician explained gently, noting Alina's evident distress. "Head injuries can be unpredictable, however. We must simply wait and monitor him carefully through the night. His body requires time and rest to recover fully from the shock of such trauma." Alina refused to leave his side throughout the long night that followed, remaining seated beside his bed despite Mrs. Whitfield's gentle urgings toward rest, her hand never releasing his own as she continued speaking softly to him throughout the dark hours, sharing every doubt, every fear, every genuine confession of love she had been too afraid to voice while he remained conscious to hear it. It was nearing dawn when Alexander finally stirred, his fingers tightening weakly around Alina's hand, a small groan escaping his lips as consciousness slowly returned. Alina leaned forward immediately, her heart soaring with relief and joy as his eyes fluttered open, disoriented but unmistakably alert. "Alina," he murmured, his voice rough and weak, though his eyes found hers with unmistakable recognition and warmth. "I am here," Alina said, tears of relief now flowing freely down her cheeks. "You are safe now, Alexander, you are home." Alexander's gaze remained fixed on her face, taking in the evident exhaustion and tear stains marking her features. "You look as though you have not slept," he observed weakly, a faint smile touching his lips despite his obvious pain. "How could I possibly rest, knowing you lay injured?" Alina replied, gently brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I was so afraid, Alexander, so afraid I would lose you before I found the courage to tell you the truth." "What truth?" Alexander asked softly, his hand tightening further around hers. Alina took a steadying breath, finally ready to voice the confession she had rehearsed countless times throughout the long, fearful night. "I love you, Alexander," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her determination. "I have loved you for weeks now, though fear and doubt kept me from admitting it, even to myself. When Victoria arrived at the gathering, when I learned of your past engagement, I allowed insecurity to convince me that perhaps I could never truly compare to whatever you once shared with her. It was foolish of me, I understand that now. I should have spoken honestly with you from the very beginning, rather than retreating into silence and doubt." Alexander's expression softened considerably at her words, genuine warmth and relief evident despite his obvious physical exhaustion. "Alina," he said gently, "whatever existed between Victoria and myself ended long ago, and for good reason. She valued security and status above genuine partnership, above true love built through shared struggle and mutual respect. What we have built together these past months is something far more precious than anything I ever shared with her. I love you, Alina. Truly, completely, in ways I never believed myself capable of feeling again after losing my parents." Alina felt her heart soar at his words, joy overwhelming the lingering exhaustion and fear of the previous night. "I am so sorry for allowing doubt to create distance between us," she said softly. "I should have trusted in what we share, rather than allowing insecurity and old rumors to cloud my judgment." "We were both at fault," Alexander admitted gently. "I should have shared the full history of my engagement to Victoria openly, rather than dismissing it so casually." Perhaps then such doubt would never have found room to grow between us at all. Alina leaned forward carefully, mindful of his injury, and pressed a gentle kiss against his lips. A kiss filled with genuine love and relief rather than the careful formality that had once characterized every interaction between them. Alexander responded warmly despite his weakened state, his free hand rising gently to cup her cheek as the kiss deepened, both finally allowing themselves to fully embrace the genuine love that had grown so unexpectedly between them. "Rest now," Alina whispered eventually, pulling back reluctantly, mindful of his continued need for recovery. "We have all the time in the world now to speak further of such matters, once you have properly healed." Alexander nodded weakly, though his eyes remained fixed on her with unmistakable adoration even as exhaustion began pulling him back toward sleep. "Stay with me," he requested softly. "Always," Alina promised, settling more comfortably beside his bed, her hand remaining firmly within his own as he finally drifted into peaceful, healing sleep. The earlier misunderstanding between them fully resolved, replaced now by a foundation of honest, unshakable love neither doubted any longer. As dawn broke fully over Ashworth Hall, casting warm golden light across the snow-covered grounds outside, Alina allowed herself finally to relax fully, exhaustion overtaking her as she rested her head gently against the side of Alexander's bed, grateful beyond measure for the genuine love they had both finally found the courage to fully embrace. A love built not merely on convenience, but on true partnership, honesty, and unwavering devotion. Alexander's recovery progressed steadily over the following weeks, his strength returning gradually beneath the careful attention of both the physician and Alina, who refused to leave his side for more than brief necessary intervals throughout his convalescence. The household staff observed the couple's deepening devotion with quiet delight, whispering amongst themselves at the obvious transformation that had occurred within Ashworth Hall since the Duke and Duchess had finally embraced their genuine feelings for one another. As winter gradually gave way to the first gentle signs of approaching spring, Alexander found himself fully recovered. The physical wound at his temple healed into nothing more than a faint scar, though the emotional wounds of past grief and guarded distance had healed far more completely, replaced now by genuine warmth and openness that colored every interaction between himself and Alina. It was during a quiet evening walk through the gardens, now beginning to show the first delicate signs of spring growth after the long winter months, that Alexander stopped Alina beneath the old stone archway near the restored fountain, his expression carrying a seriousness that immediately captured her full attention. "Alina," he said, taking both her hands gently within his own, "our marriage began as an arrangement of pure necessity, a bargain struck between two strangers seeking to solve entirely separate problems. Yet somewhere along this journey we have shared together, that arrangement transformed into something I never dared hope to find again after losing so much. I love you, Alina, completely and without reservation. I would like, if you are willing, to renew our vows before our closest friends and family, not out of obligation this time, but out of genuine, chosen love." Alina felt tears of joy pricking at her eyes as she absorbed his heartfelt request, her heart overflowing with happiness far beyond anything she had imagined possible when she first agreed to this marriage months before. "Nothing would make me happier, Alexander," she replied softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you too, completely and without any doubt remaining in my heart." Word of the couple's decision to renew their vows spread quickly throughout the county, and preparations began immediately for a celebration far grander than their original, hastily arranged wedding had allowed. This time, Alina found herself surrounded by genuine excitement and joy rather than the quiet resignation that had characterized her original wedding day. Her father, overjoyed at witnessing his daughter's genuine happiness rather than merely her financial security, insisted on contributing generously toward the celebration despite Alina's protests that such expense remained unnecessary. Mrs. Whitfield and the entire household staff threw themselves enthusiastically into preparations, decorating the great hall with fresh spring flowers gathered from Alina's now flourishing gardens, arranging tables laden with the finest foods the estate could provide, and ensuring every detail reflected the genuine love, now defining the household, rather than mere aristocratic obligation. Even the tenant families from the eastern farms, whom Alina and Alexander had worked so tirelessly to assist during the flooding crisis months before, insisted upon contributing to the celebration in whatever small ways they could manage, several of the village women arriving early to help arrange flowers throughout the hall, their genuine affection for the Duke and Duchess evident in every careful detail they contributed. On the morning of the renewed ceremony, Alina stood once more before her mirror, though this time the reflection staring back at her carried none of the uncertainty and fear that had marked her original wedding day. Instead, genuine joy radiated from her expression, her eyes bright with anticipation rather than clouded with worry over an unknown future. "You look radiant, Your Grace," Clara said warmly, fastening the final delicate buttons of Alina's gown, a beautiful creation of soft ivory silk adorned with delicate embroidered flowers that echoed the very garden she had worked so hard to restore. "I feel radiant," Alina admitted, smiling brightly at her own reflection. "This day carries none of the fear that accompanied our first ceremony. Only joy, Clara, pure, complete joy." The ceremony itself took place within the very gardens Alina had restored with her own hands, the spring flowers now blooming brilliantly beneath a clear afternoon sky, surrounded by friends, family, tenants, and staff who had all become genuine parts of their shared life together. Alexander waited beneath a beautifully decorated archway near the old stone fountain, his expression carrying none of the guarded formality of their original wedding, replaced instead by unmistakable love and anticipation as he watched Alina approach. When she reached him, taking his offered hand within her own, Alexander leaned close, whispering softly enough that only she could hear his words. "You are even more beautiful than I remembered from our first wedding day," he murmured, "though I confess I hardly recall feeling anything but nervous formality that day. Today I feel only overwhelming gratitude and love." Alina smiled warmly at his words, her heart overflowing with happiness as the clergyman began the ceremony once more, this time surrounded by genuine celebration rather than solemn necessity. When the time came to exchange their renewed vows, both Alexander and Alina spoke with voices thick with genuine emotion, promising not merely practical partnership, but complete devotion, honesty, and unwavering love for whatever years lay ahead of them together. "I, Alexander, take you, Alina, not out of necessity as before, but out of genuine, chosen love," Alexander declared, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "I promise to cherish you, to support you, to build alongside you a life filled with honesty, partnership, and unwavering devotion, for as long as we both shall live." Alina repeated similar heartfelt vows of her own, her voice steady despite the tears of joy now flowing freely down her cheeks, promising Alexander the same genuine devotion he had offered her in return. When the clergyman finally pronounced them husband and wife once more, Alexander did not offer the polite, formal nod that had characterized their original ceremony. Instead, he pulled Alina gently into his arms, kissing her warmly and completely before the entire assembled crowd, who erupted immediately into joyful applause and celebration. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, music and laughter filling the gardens and great hall of Ashworth Hall in a manner the estate had not experienced in many years. Alina danced with Alexander beneath strings of warm lantern light, both of them laughing freely, completely unguarded in their happiness, surrounded by the genuine community they had built together through months of shared struggle, partnership, and growing love. Even Lady Camden, who had first introduced the arrangement between Alina and Alexander so many months before, approached the couple during a quiet moment amid the celebration, her expression carrying obvious satisfaction and joy. "I confess," she said warmly, embracing Alina tightly, "I hoped for a peaceful, practical arrangement between you both when I first suggested this match. I never dared imagine it would blossom into something quite so beautiful." "Nor did we," Alina admitted, glancing warmly toward Alexander, who stood nearby engaged in cheerful conversation with several of the tenant farmers who had become genuine friends over the preceding months. But I have never been more grateful for anything in my entire life. As the celebration continued late into the night, Alina found herself standing quietly beside Alexander near the edge of the gardens, watching the joyful gathering with a sense of profound gratitude and contentment. The neglected, sorrowful estate she had first arrived at so many months before had transformed entirely, not merely through restored gardens and repaired buildings, but through the genuine warmth, community, and love that now filled every corner of Ashworth Hall. "Thank you," Alexander said softly, wrapping his arm gently around her waist as they watched the celebration together. "For everything you have brought into my life, Alina. I was a man who had forgotten how to hope for genuine happiness, buried beneath duty and grief for far too long. You reminded me what it feels like to truly live again." Alina leaned contentedly against him, her heart full beyond measure. "We reminded each other," she corrected gently. "I arrived here believing love was a luxury I could not afford, that duty alone must guide my choices from that point forward. You taught me that genuine love and duty need not exist in opposition to one another. Sometimes, if we are fortunate enough, they can beautifully intertwine instead." As the last of the evening's celebration finally began to wind down, Alexander turned to face Alina fully, his expression carrying a warmth and certainty that spoke of a future built on genuine partnership rather than mere practical necessity. "Whatever challenges the future may yet bring," he said softly, "I know now, without any doubt remaining, that I wish to face them alongside you, Alina." "Always." "Always," Alina echoed softly, rising slightly to press a tender kiss against his lips beneath the star-filled evening sky. Ashworth Hall, once cold and hollow with grief and loneliness, now stood transformed entirely, its halls filled with warmth, laughter, and genuine love that would continue growing steadily throughout the many years still to come. What had begun as a simple bargain born of desperate necessity had blossomed, against all expectation, into a true, enduring love story, one built not merely on convenience, but on honesty, partnership, and the unwavering devotion of two hearts who had found, quite unexpectedly, exactly what they had never dared to hope they might discover within a marriage neither had originally chosen for themselves. 3 years passed at Ashworth Hall, each season bringing its own quiet joys to the estate that had once stood so hollow and forgotten. The gardens Alina had first restored with her own hands now flourished beyond anything even she had imagined possible, drawing visitors from neighboring estates who came simply to admire the vibrant roses climbing along the ancient stone walls, the carefully tended paths winding between beds of lavender and wildflowers that seemed to bloom in every season. Alina stood now beneath the old stone archway near the fountain, watching with quiet delight as her young daughter, barely 2 years old, toddled unsteadily across the grass, chasing after a small orange butterfly with delighted squeals of laughter. Little Rose, named for the very gardens where her parents had first found their way toward genuine love, had inherited her mother's warm brown eyes and her father's determined spirit, a combination that already promised considerable trouble in the years ahead. "She grows more like you each day," Alexander observed warmly, joining Alina beneath the archway, his gaze fixed affectionately on their daughter's clumsy pursuit of the elusive butterfly. Stubborn, curious, and utterly unwilling to accept defeat, regardless of how many times that butterfly escapes her grasp. Alina laughed softly, leaning contentedly against her husband's side. "I rather think she inherited that particular trait from her father," she countered playfully. "I recall a certain duke who once insisted on rebuilding an entire storehouse himself, rain or otherwise, rather than accepting any solution beyond complete success." Alexander smiled at the memory, pressing a gentle kiss against her temple. "A fair point," he conceded warmly. The estate itself had flourished alongside their growing family. The financial difficulties that had once burdened Alexander's inheritance long since resolved through careful management, and the genuine partnership he and Alina had built regarding every significant decision affecting Ashworth Hall and its many dependents. The tenant families, whose survival Alina and Alexander had fought so hard to secure during that difficult first winter, had grown increasingly prosperous under their continued careful stewardship, their farms thriving through methods of cooperation and mutual support that Alina herself had first suggested during that early crisis. Mrs. Whitfield, now considerably grayer but no less devoted to the household she had served so faithfully for decades, often remarked to the younger staff that she had never witnessed such genuine happiness within Ashworth Hall's walls, not even during the years before tragedy had claimed both the old Duke and Duchess. "Love built through genuine partnership," she would say knowingly, "proves far stronger than love built merely on youthful passion alone. Our current Duke and Duchess understand this truth better than most, having discovered it through their own remarkable journey together." Lady Victoria Pemberton, meanwhile, had eventually married a wealthy merchant from the northern counties, a match that provided the financial security she had always valued above genuine emotional connection. Whether she ever fully understood the manipulative nature of her own actions during those difficult early months of Alina and Alexander's marriage remained uncertain, though she was never again seen at Ashworth Hall following that fateful winter, her attempts at disruption having ultimately failed against the genuine strength of the bond Alina and Alexander had built together. As Rose finally succeeded in gently catching her butterfly within her small, cupped hands, only to release it moments later with delighted giggles, Alina felt her heart swell with a contentment she had never dared imagine possible during those early, uncertain days when duty alone had guided her toward this unexpected marriage. She thought often, during quiet, reflective moments such as this one, of her younger self, so frightened and uncertain as she first arrived at Ashworth Hall, unable to imagine the genuine happiness that awaited her within these very halls. "Do you ever think of how differently things might have unfolded?" Alina asked Alexander thoughtfully, as they watched their daughter continue her joyful exploration of the garden. "Had circumstances not forced our families together as they did?" Alexander considered the question seriously for a long moment before responding. "I try not to dwell on such possibilities," he admitted finally. "Though I confess, I sometimes wonder how many years I might have continued living behind those careful walls I had built around my heart, had necessity not brought you into my life when it did. I fear I might have remained forever trapped within grief and duty alone, never discovering the genuine joy that comes from true partnership. Perhaps fate simply understood what we ourselves could not yet see," Alina suggested softly, "that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead toward the most beautiful destinations." Their quiet reflection was interrupted moments later by the arrival of Alina's younger brother, now grown into a confident young man completing his studies before beginning his own promising career, who had come to visit alongside their father for several weeks during the pleasant spring season. Lord Hartley, considerably recovered from the financial ruin that had once threatened his family so severely, walked with renewed vigor and confidence these days, his gratitude toward Alexander and Alina evident in every visit he made to Ashworth Hall. "Grandfather," Rose called out excitedly, abandoning her butterfly pursuit entirely in favor of rushing toward her beloved grandfather, who lifted her easily into his arms with obvious delight. "My dear girl," Lord Hartley said warmly, "you grow more beautiful and troublesome with each visit, much like your mother did at your age." Alina laughed warmly at her father's teasing observation, moving forward to embrace both her father and brother with genuine affection. The Hartley family's fortunes had improved considerably since that first desperate agreement had saved them from ruin, Lord Hartley having wisely invested the funds provided through Alina's marriage into careful improvements across his own more modest estate, ensuring their family's continued security for generations to come. That evening, as the extended family gathered together within the great hall for a warm, joyful dinner, Alina found herself reflecting once more on the remarkable journey that had brought them all to this moment of genuine happiness and security. The hall itself, once so cold and formal during her first uncertain days as Duchess, now echoed constantly with laughter and warmth, filled with the comfortable chaos of family life rather than the sterile formality that had once defined every corner of Ashworth Hall. Following dinner, as Rose finally succumbed to exhaustion and was carried off to bed by her devoted nurse, Eleanor and Alexander found a quiet moment together on the balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens, the same gardens where their genuine love story had first begun to unfold so many years before. "I received word today," Alexander mentioned, his tone carrying quiet satisfaction, "that the Eastern farms have produced their finest harvest yet this year, exceeding even the most optimistic projections from Mr. Abbott and the other tenant families." "That is wonderful news," Eleanor replied warmly, genuine pride evident in her voice. "Their hard work and resilience these past years have certainly earned such success." "Their success," Alexander corrected gently, "owes much to your own wisdom and compassion, Eleanor. Your suggestion of cooperation between the farms during that first difficult winter established patterns of mutual support that continue benefiting the entire estate to this day." Eleanor smiled softly, leaning contentedly against her husband's shoulder as they gazed out over the peaceful, moonlit gardens below. "We built it together," she reminded him gently, echoing words she had spoken to him years before, "just as we have built everything else within this remarkable life we now share." Alexander turned to face her fully then, his expression carrying the same genuine warmth and devotion that had grown so steadily between them since those first uncertain days of their marriage. "I find myself more grateful with each passing year," he said softly, "for that desperate letter your father once sent, for Lady Camden's wisdom in suggesting our match, and most of all, for your own remarkable courage in accepting an arrangement that could easily have remained nothing more than cold, practical necessity." "And I remain grateful," Eleanor replied warmly, "for the man who chose to see beyond mere obligation, who allowed himself, however cautiously at first, to embrace genuine partnership and love rather than remaining forever guarded behind duty alone." As the stars brightened further overhead, and the gentle spring breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming roses up toward their quiet balcony retreat, Alexander drew Eleanor gently into his arms, both of them content simply to exist together within this peaceful moment, surrounded by the genuine happiness and security they had built together through years of honest partnership, mutual respect, and unwavering devotion. Their story, which had begun through desperate necessity and careful, guarded formality, had transformed remarkably into something far more precious than either had ever dared imagine possible. A true, enduring love built not merely on convenient circumstance, but on genuine courage, honesty, and the willingness of two once guarded hearts to fully embrace vulnerability and hope. Ashworth Hall itself stood now as living testament to that transformation, its once cold and empty halls filled eternally with warmth, laughter, and the enduring legacy of a love story that would continue growing stronger with each passing year they remained fortunate enough to share together.